My guests this hour are Saul and Morty. Saul is Gary Morson. He is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University. Morty is Morton Schapiro, the president of Northwestern University and a professor of economics. They came on to discuss their latest book, Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. Here's the first segment of our interview.
Morty and Saul, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here.
Me too, Charles.
So I don't know if it was an excerpt or just a writing about your book in an email I got from Persuasion. I said I have to have them on to talk about this. So you have a book that came out in March, Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. And I want to start by asking, what is the new fundamentalism that you're talking about?
I'm glad you like that column in Persuasion. We've actually written 6 op-eds / essays based on the book. And actually, I think we got more of a reaction, Saul, on this one than the other ones.
We did.
So we're pretty happy about that. A number of people seem to have noticed. It hasn't made us a bestseller yet, Charles. So
we count on you for that.
But we're counting on you.
I'm going to make that happen. Let's make that happen.
Yeah, well, let's make that happen. And, when we talk about fundamentalism, and Saul wrote this section of chapter 2, I think, of Saul, about the history of fundamentalism. Charles, you might know it goes back 100 years or so to the interpretation of Christian texts, and Saul can talk about that. But for me, when I think about fundamentalism, I think about, what are the things that every one of us believes that are not open to be refuted? Karl Popper, of course, the great philosopher of science, said falsifiability is key. And I think we all have some things that we absolutely believe in our heart and soul, and they make us who we are. And that's fundamentalist, because nobody, I happen to be an observant Jew. Nobody's going to convince me there's no God. I don't care. I don't enter those conversations. So in that regard, I'm a fundamentalist. Saul believes existence of great literature and Tolstoy, the greatest writer ever. That's a fundamentalist belief. So it's probably okay, I would say, Charles, to have some fundamentalist beliefs. One of the early reviewers of the book had a great line, said that, you want to keep your mind wide open, but not so wide open that your brain falls out.
I saw that.
But if most of your views are not open to being refuted by objective facts, you probably have a problem. And moreover, democracy has a problem. Saul,
is that where we're going now? Yeah, Saul, is that where we're going now? Is that the problem?
Well, I'm afraid we seem to be headed in that direction. And, I am by training a Russian specialist. And so I am very sensitive, perhaps too sensitive at times, to parallels with Russia, in the early 20th century and what it eventually led to after 1917. And one of the things you could say about that Russian intelligentsia, which I sometimes see around me, is the absolute moral certainty that they are right about everything and they can't doubt. And if you think that way, then there's no reason to have freedom of speech or democracy, right? You don't have freedom of speech because anything you don't believe is simply a lie. Why do you allow people to lie? I remember when I was in the Soviet Union in, the 1960s, I remember a Russian saying to me, of course we have complete freedom of speech here. We just don't allow people to lie. Well, that's sort of where, I hear some similar sort of things, now, even from colleagues, and they don't find, if I tell that joke, they don't find it funny, and democracy depends on the notion that, no matter, you've been wrong before, even if your values are good, your particular policies might be wrong. Other people have been proven right before. I mean, we just have, apparently this is maybe the case with the, origin of this virus, that people think that was completely rejected as crazy. Maybe, who knows, maybe true. You can be wrong, right? And democracy depends on the notion that you're not speaking divine or mathematical truth. You have an opinion, and opinions are human and fallible, so you allow dialogue, and maybe you'll both learn from it. That's what democracy depends on. Otherwise, you have a one-party state.
So when did you recognize that it started to shift beyond what we all considered norms, like you talk about. It's funny that I have to say this jokingly, but 2 + 2 = 4, or that there is a God, that, you know, people had those things, whether you agree with it or not. They were normal things that people thought were, you know, that they could be fundamentalist about. When did you notice the shift to it being other things that were totally arbitrary and more opinion and feelings than what people thought were fact? Saul, you can take that one too.
Well, when did I first notice the tendency towards this absolute certainty? Do you mean that?
Yes. But on things that we didn't do it on before. So, you know.
Good. Yeah. Well, I have, you know, in my library, is a topic that's interested me for a long time, an issue of the New Republic in the 1990s making this point. That was the first time this sort of started. Then it died down for a while, and then it picked up again. So it's accelerated in, you know, I don't know, the last 5 or 6 years. My students now have grown up in a very different environment than students 10 years ago. But it's not brand new. I say you can trace it back, you know, to a lot of discussion in the 90s. There were a couple of books, you know, in the 90s. There was this wonderful book by this Yale professor David Bromwich called "Politics by Other Means," from, you know, about this in the 90s. He's a contributor to Dissent, and he was disturbed by this from, you know, left point of view. It's not. There's a tendency, you know, in the American tradition to do this. It comes from, you know, Puritanism, which led to witch trials at one point. And there's a democratic tendency in America. And they're both always in competition, you know, how I see it. And so this is a revision of the old Puritan tradition, you know, in another guise.
Okay. So it started to, you know, you talk about that article in the 90s and beyond that. So, Morty, can you talk about if there was one trigger? I don't know if there was a trigger that said, okay, now I'm noticing this trend, but now I think we need to write about it. There's a book here, because now it's not a one-off. It's not, that's just one guy. Because a lot of times we get that. That's just that guy or those small group of people doing and saying this. But you realize that this was becoming, you know, endemic.
Well, Charles, this book comes from a class, a pretty popular undergraduate class that Saul and I have taught together now. Was it 12 years in a row we've taught this, over 1,200 students over that time. It's on dialogue, Charles. Mm-hmm. And I think that in teaching this class, we noticed that there's this rising fundamentalism in a range of different fields. And we thought that maybe the genesis of that came from similar forces, and maybe the solution, we hope, could be similar as well. So one field is economics, one field is politics, one field is religion, and one field is literature. I agree with what you two just said, that it tended to really take hold in the 90s, but I'm always looking as an applied econometrician, what changed? If you try to estimate a model, look for some dramatic change. And I think what changed was we went into silos, into echo chambers. So when I grew up, it didn't probably matter if you watched Peter Jennings or Brokaw or Dan Rather on the three big networks. They all pretty much told the same story. Which magazine, whether it was Time or U.S. News and World Report, or my favorite was Newsweek, you got a pretty much similar story. And that changed with the revolution in telecommunications and then eventually the onset of social media. And now, I talk to my friends, and, the ones who are conservatives, they just live on Fox News and they never watch anything else. And they read certain columnists and they're on certain web pages, and they just hear what they believe echoed to them over and over again. And I have many more friends, being in academy, not surprisingly, on the left, who only watch MSNBC and the CNN, and, they read certain columnists in the New York Times. And, and it's comforting to have your thoughts echo back to you, Charles, because, it doesn't get you out of your comfort zone, but it's really bad for democracy. So I think that it's now compartmentalized in a way that it never was. And part of that is that the change in media and the change in the way things are reported. And again, it's so easy to live in a silo. It wasn't as easy until recent.
Coming up, more with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
In Denver, and I just can't remember her name.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. And if you heard the first segment, you know it has nothing to do with the weird Stanley Kubrick film. In this segment, we talk about partisanship, the media, and how it has exacerbated the problem. We highlight how centrists get such a bad rep and how dangerous it is for people not to hear opposing views.
You talk about the political divide, but it seems like the one thing that liberals and conservatives can agree on is that whether it's intentional or not, that the media played a part into it. And, you know, I like to assume positive intent, so I don't go through saying that there was some media people in the back room saying, how can we split the country up or how can we hurt conservatives and liberals? But I think it's evident, right? I don't think I'm almost shocked by how few people notice it. It's like, you know, you think of entertainment, and we used to say that reality mirrors entertainment, and the same thing. It goes both ways. It's like a chicken and egg, which is first, because you see these TV shows, movies, the way they portray the news, and a cynic will say, well, they have some ulterior motive. And I'm like, well, no, they're reporting what they're seeing, that they're hearing, because somebody showed it to them, and then it creates this cycle. So because there was a movie about it, now people react this way, and then it never ends. So I don't think it was intentional. So I don't mean to beat up on the media, but I do think that, like one example, we talk about crime a lot, and it always devolves into race. And as a black man, you hear those things about blacks and crime all the time. And I look at it and I say, well, my argument is always, maybe to be different, and I get the media, they're just reporting the news. If we didn't have so many stories, if the stories weren't so heavily weighted about the black man with a knife or a black person being a criminal, or for that matter, being shot by the police, because, you know, it's not really the reality. Because, I mean, in the book review I was reading, and in the setup, you're talking about some of the polarizing things and some of the problems, good and bad, because it's exposing some problems. And of course, I noticed it as a black man. One of the problems was, you know, dealing with anti-black racism. And I always wonder how people view that and how I'm looked at as a black person when I talk about it, because you talk about the polarization. And I think that we tend to feel that that is the norm. And it's not political, but even though a very small percentage of blacks are shot by the police and a very small percentage of blacks commit violent crimes. But what we hear is blacks commit 50% of the violent crimes. Blacks do X, Y, Z. But that's not blacks. That's a small percentage of blacks. And even though that number is higher than the percentage in other groups, it's not the norm. So the average black person is sitting around like, I've never broken the law. But if I watch the news, this is what I see all day on the news. People don't really, so we talk about the white reaction to it, but we get very little comment about the fact that it affects blacks too. And I have friends that don't realize it until I ask them questions. So I tell this often because it's important. They're upper middle class blacks. They're doing well in America. They've never had a negative interaction with a police officer. Yet they parrot back what you hear in the media. So they'll say, well, I'm afraid for my son. Or they'll say, the cops are hunting us down. Or they'll say this. I said, well, you've been black for 50 years. Have you ever felt hunted before? And they say, no. And so I said, well, why now? And they said, well, because police are shooting black men more. But we all know that's not the case. But it doesn't matter because, you know, at that point, reality trumps, their beliefs trumps reality. So what do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I would just say, you know, whether it's intentional from the media or not, and I happen to share your view that it happened. There are technological revolutions all over the place in media and consolidation, and whether they were clever marketers to figure out how to create a market niche and make more money or not. And in one of our talks, people criticized us to say that, it's all capitalism that gave rise to the forces that grew fundamentalism. And that might be a fundamentalist view, Charles. I don't know. But, it is where it is. We live in echo chambers and silos, and you have to force yourself to get out of your comfort zone. I think human nature is we want to be comforted. Right? And I kind of add one other thing. And then, you mentioned about what the far left and far right might agree on. There's one other thing, I think, a point we try to make in the book, is that another thing that the extremists on both sides seem to agree on is they hate the middle. And I don't think that had always been the case, Charles. I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist, but, this idea that there's almost some grudging respect for people 180 degrees different. I'm a member of the squad, I'm a progressive, I'm far. I mean, that's grudging respect, but at least they can understand that there's this view.
No, you're right. You're right. They actually say it. They actually say, at least I can respect AOC. I don't agree with it, but at least she's not in the mushy middle. At least she's not a rhino. Right.
That's what we try to argue in the book, this mushy middle and this almost open contempt for people 90 degrees different.
Right.
And that's why, oh my God, do you believe, now President Biden, then candidate, was good friends with John McCain? How could that happen? Or going back that, Barry Goldwater and George McGovern were best. I mean, nobody can even understand that way of thinking about it. So there's almost, and that I think is really bad. The original point, Charles, for democracy.
So you want to get in there?
Depends on compromise and respect. And, the extreme views that, it's such a polarized reality. And again, it's not just in politics. People talk about economics, and we have chapter 4 in the book, even though economists generally agree on a lot of economic policy, pundits don't and observers don't. I mean, you have the market fundamentalists, never interfere, let's vote down the latest Biden stimulus policy. And then you have this incredible rise of anti-market fundamentalists that the problem is capitalism. We thought that was relegated Saul to the dustbin of history, right? But, this incredible distrust of capitalism, and there's no way you can have a humane capitalist system, as an economist, I find terrifying. I find that scarier than anything else, but that's just my view.
That's because you're an economist, right?
Because I'm an economist.
Well, we're going to break those 4 down, but I think Saul looks like he has some thoughts, so I'd like to hear what he has to say about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's part of the problem is there are too many people who never actually encounter a real person who disagrees. They take the caricature from their media and think that's what they really are. Oh, I know what, Republicans think. Well, how do you know? Well, I listen to CNN. They tell me what they think, which is sort of like having, a prosecutor after presenting his own case, present what he says the defense's case would be. Right. It's not a good way of doing it. You don't really understand the other point of view until you can paraphrase it in such a way that someone on the other side would say, that's right, that's what I believe, right? And people, that's why you have to actually hear people. But if you never encountered, I know people who have, I could tell stories about people who, they just have never encountered a serious person, who disagreed. This is a part of that, that silo effect. And so, you can believe anything about someone you never meet. Our neighborhoods are becoming, ideologically segregated the way they, are used to be, as in some cases still are racially segregated. Right? When I remember when I started teaching, I would have students who would, express horror that, I'm a Catholic. Will I marry a Protestant? Like, no, of course not. I mean, it was still, people took that seriously. And now it's the idea, I couldn't think of marrying someone from the other party. That would be hellish. They have to be a bad person, well, why don't you get to know some? And then you find out that, their values are very similar. Their ways of reaching them, what they think is the best way to enact them, may be very different. But they, they love their children the way you do. They want, prosperity and peace the way you do. They just see a different way of doing it. They're not bad people. Everybody's experience is partial in both senses of the word. You see only a part of experience, you generalize from it. That's why you want to talk to somebody else, so you can expand the experience that you're drawing from.
Saul is right on the money. However, I think it's important to note, too, as polarized as these two camps are, we sometimes, especially those of us who pay such close attention to this stuff, kind of forget the fact that probably somewhere around 70% of the people don't consider themselves left or right, and they're not in that number of polarization. More with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Nothing else matters.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. And in this segment, we talk about the fundamentalism that they're talking about in their book, and they focus on 4 key areas where this seems to be especially problematic. And here they point out those areas and give some examples.
But in the book, you alluded to that earlier, the 4 areas you highlight in the book where these things are really taking hold: politics, economics, religion, and the study of literature. So give me an example so people can understand how these problems and this fundamentalism is permeating in these areas.
Well, if I started again with chapter 4, economics, and again, I took the lead in there, as you could guess. This is the 3rd book Saul and I have done together, and Saul's a really good writer, and he loves footnotes. I'm an economist. I love numbers, and footnotes are my friend, but not 511 of them, which is Minds Wide Shut. I should tell you, Charles, our previous book, Sense and Sensibility, which did really well, and it's actually in paperback in Mandarin and selling very well, I hear, in China. But that had 311 footnotes, and I said to Saul, we need to change the footnote count by 200. And we did. It went from 311 to 511. So getting back to economics, Saul, and I love you, there's always been a group among economists who misread the founder of modern economics, Adam Smith. We talk about that in length in this book. We also had a chapter on that in a previous book. One of the traits of fundamentalism is to have a so-called sacred text. And it's often one that isn't actually read, and it's misinterpreted, and that's what Wealth of Nations was, 1776 for Adam Smith. So, there are people out there, and you can read it every day in the media now about, we're crushing market incentives because Biden's spending all this money and the like, and the market will figure it out. And almost every economist realizes that, there are market failures, a whole bunch of them out there, and therefore you need some intervention. But then do you throw away the market? And that's the anti-market fundamentalists. And that's really grown. And I'll tell you, in our classes at Northwestern, even 12 years ago, when we would do the economics section, which is about a third of the course, people were like, okay, well, that's interesting. You could have more humane versions of economics and some variant of free markets. And now it's more like, we got to get rid of capitalism. And the answer is replace it with what? I mean, if there's anything, history suggests that there's no better way to allocate scarce resources than markets. So that's been a rise, and that's the theme of the economics chapter.
Well, I hate to cheat, but you don't often get the economics professor here. So I have to tell you, I just had a conversation about capitalism with another guest. And my point was most logical free market capitalists don't want no regulations. That's not really what they're saying. But the regulations have to be sensible. And you have to understand that at some point, it's not capitalism anymore. There has to be a line. And the argument, I say, to simplify, I said all the isms work. Socialism, communism, they all work if human nature is not flawed. Since that's not the case, we have to do what is best. And like you say, nothing has been proven to be better than that. And I think that a lot of these conversations lack context, and that's what the thing is.
I agree 100%, Charles. The other thing I would add is that we have a lot of empirical studies out there. In the sciences, people say, okay, well, that's, this vaccine works. It doesn't. People take that as the truth because that's science. But in a lot of the social sciences, including my field, economics, we do objective empirical study. Everybody wants to reduce child poverty. The SNAP program is very effective, and economists across the ideological spectrum can show that. There are other programs that work much, less successfully, and to ignore that because, I got to do good. Well, part of doing good, and Saul actually wrote this section in the book, is not being wasteful. I mean, if you have a whole bunch of studies that show the Pell Grant is very effective. It lowers the price for the price elasticity, the responsiveness for the students who wouldn't go to college. It's a good program. Forgiving, we argue, for everyone, student loan debt is a terrible program because, a third of the people have graduate degrees, almost half come from the upper strata of the American income.
Regressive.
It's a terrible policy.
It's regressive, right? You're giving money to the people who don't need the money.
So, find the people who are really poor, find the people who didn't graduate, and forgive their debt. But, in the name of equality, that's just one of many examples we discuss in the book of let's look at the data and let's think, not ideologically, but fact-based. And once you do, you come up with very different solutions.
But let me just add one thing to, what we said before, and that is whenever you have a policy, if you focus only on the benefits and not the costs, you're not really understanding the policy because everything you do has both costs and benefits. The way to tell a fundamentalist is when they insist only on the benefits and refuse to look at the costs.
Or the other.
Or the other. Mm-hmm. One way you can, if someone says, I'm sorry, we're not going to allow a cost-benefit analysis of this policy by whatever the agency is, then they're a fundamentalist. They don't really care about doing the most good, because if they did, they would pick the policy that accomplished the most given a set of resources. They would insist on a cost-benefit analysis.
Coming up, more with Saul and Morty, professors at Northwestern University and the authors of Minds Wide Shut. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. And I had asked Saul a question at the end of the last segment, and here he answers how the fundamentalists are infiltrating literary studies.
Mention literary studies. Well, in literary studies, what you've had in the last, it's been developing gradually, I would say, for decades. The idea that it's a kind of negative fundamentalism. Instead of saying, we know exactly what's good and what the truth is about literature, you say, there is no such thing as good literature. Literature, it's whatever the power structures say is good literature is. That's all there is. There's no meaning to a literary work. It's whatever you want to say the literary work means, what your interpretive community says. That's it. Well, that's a kind of negative fundamentalism, and it makes it impossible to learn from literature. If the only thing in literature is what you put there, then why read it at all? And if there's no such thing, no difference between Shakespeare and a laundry list, it's a lot easier to read a laundry list. So that's where the negative fundamentalism, comes in literary studies. And, it's changed the way literature is taught. It's changed the sort of works that are assigned. And you want to ask, well, English professors and foreign language professors are complaining that students don't take literature anymore. And, my answer is, well, you don't believe in literature either, so why should they? They're just, if what you say is true, they are behaving rationally by keeping away.
That's true. So you mentioned that there were several articles. Obviously, I caught that last one. And in that article, in Persuasion, you highlighted the campuses. So I want to know, you all are there. I am not. So is there something different about the fundamentalism that's going on there?
One of the things that students love, Charles, and are teaching this class, we're best friends and co-authors, and I love the guy, but we don't agree on everything. And he's, maybe because he's from the humanities and I'm from the empirical social sciences, but I don't think that, when I hear that campuses are indoctrination mills, I don't see it. Maybe because I'm in economics and, I don't see my colleagues putting, ideology into what's supposed to be objective economics, and the STEM fields don't do it. Engineering doesn't do it. So much of the academy doesn't. And, it is the case. And we talk about that in the book. You look at the data. I mean, the professorate is much more to the left than the American public. But I don't think we're indoctrination mills. And I got to tell you, Charles, as somebody who's been teaching for generation after generation, disease, before millennials and the like, that if you try to indoctrinate undergrads, they run the other way. And they might give you back what they need to get their A, but I don't think it changes their belief. So, I don't know. I think a lot of it is the criticism from the far right is, it's not an academe I'm familiar with, and I've been in this business for a long time. Now, Saul's got a different take, as he often does.
Okay, Saul.
Well, it's partly that I'm in the humanities, and I wish I were in the humanist thought like economists, but it's not me saying that they think that the only way to do things is political and to insist on that there's no objective truth, there's only political power. That is the governing orthodoxy of the field. It's not what the right charges them with. It's what, if you read their own publications when they're talking to each other, that's what they say. It's almost, I'm in sort of the one little area where that is not the true Russian studies, because people in Russian studies know where that leads. And so it's really true. It's quite, the atmosphere of my field is very different from French and English. You have people who think like French in my field, but they don't dominate. They're just one of many strains. Secondly, look at it this way. You not so long ago, about a year ago, you had 120 professors at Princeton sign a statement saying that before a Princeton professor should be allowed to publish something, it had to be reviewed by a censorship committee that would see if it was violating one of their preferred social norms. Now, this is professors demanding censorship of other professors. I'm willing to bet that 90% of them were humanists and none were economists.
What I think about it, again, with getting to numbers, Charles, let me just give you some very quick ones that recently came up in Gallup polls. The first one is that asking Americans, what's the greatest threat to our country? And more than half of Americans said other Americans. Now, I don't know what that would have been, Charles, when you were growing up or when Saul and I were growing up, but I got to believe, it would have been Russia, it would have been China, it would have been whatever. I can't believe other Americans. And then when they asked people to describe people in the opposing political party, and half people said enemies. Half of Americans describe members of the other party as enemies. And then a third of Americans said that they could justify violence to achieve political objective. And then the scariest of them all, it's the last one, I'm sorry, I love numbers, is that 25% of Americans in a recent Gallup poll said they support secession. I mean, wow. That's a quarter of Americans said they would leave this country. And, you think about what's the future, and I don't think it's really college campuses or, fostering this kind of thing. I mean, I think it's that's what we argue in the book, that it's a broader set of threats to democracy. But those numbers, again, I wish I had what they were 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. I had your good question in the beginning. When did this develop? But I know where we are now, and we're in a very scary place.
What's worse is most of those people polled would think that the other side is the cause of all the problems as well. Coming up, my final segment with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You like me and I like you.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I have reached the final segment with Saul and Morty, authors of Minds Wide Shut, and I end the conversation, as I often do, by asking, what do we do about this problem?
you have to be courageous enough to defend the expression of the other point of view, even if it's not your own. Most of my colleagues would not see that as a good thing to do. You're not defending freedom if you defend the freedom of your side to talk. It's when you defend the others. Because if you lose that, you never get it back. If you lose your position on taxes, it can be reversed.
I would just say, Charles, reiterate something we talked about earlier in your show, is that the first thing is recognize the fundamentalism in each of us. Ask yourself, this is what I believe, and, what's open to debate and what isn't. And if it's mainly what isn't open for debate, you got a problem, right? So I'm always thinking about, what makes me who I am, and certain things are not on the table. I try to put more things on the table. The second thing is try to get out of your comfort zone. I watch Fox News. I read a lot of things that upset me, but, it's not just the echo chamber. And then, if you don't do it, we were talking, Charles, and I'm going to give a shout out for one of your recent shows that I really loved from a couple of weeks ago. It's not just democracy, but it's the way we feel about ourselves and about the world. And I think, some people say if you have this righteous indignation, it makes you who you are, and you thrive on your anger and your hatred and vilification of the other. But I think it actually takes a real toll on you. And I was telling before we logged on, I loved the interview you did with the author of Saving My Enemy from a couple of weeks ago. And I hope our listeners, if they got this far in this show, they should go back to May 3rd and listen to the second part of that show. And, I was just telling Saul, here are these, I just set it up very quickly, Charles. You have a GI, Battle of the Bulge, like my father fought, and then you have a German soldier consumed with hate, both severely traumatized by the war, who created a friendship. And I don't think they learned so much, at least the way, I haven't read it yet, I ordered it, but from your wonderful interview, Charles, I don't think it was that they began to, respect each other's views, but they felt better about themselves. They realized the basic humanity that's out there. And I think in forgiving the other, they forgave themselves and they came to peace. And I think that's ultimately the cost if you vilify everybody and you live in a world of hate. And again, I thought that I was really moved by your interview from the author of Saving My Enemy, which is why, again, before you logged on, that's what I was talking about.
I completely agree. Hate temporarily makes you feel good, but makes you a worse person, and in the long run,
They are Saul and Morty. So Saul is a professor of Arts and Humanities and a professor in Slavic languages and literatures at Northwestern University. Morty is the president of Northwestern University and a professor of economics. Their current book, Minds Wide Shut, not Eyes Wide Shut, but Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us, and previous book, Sense and Sensibility. I'm going to check this one out, too. What economics can learn from the humanities. That sounds very interesting as well. I appreciate your time. Wish we could talk more. Would love to do it again. And thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. You're a great interviewer, Charles. Much appreciated.